Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to The Reason We Learn. I'm your host, Deb Tillman, and this is a channel where we cover all things related to education in America. If you are not currently subscribed, please consider subscribing. It helps me get the word out to other parents and educators and concerned citizens. And I hope you will also consider liking and sharing this broadcast so we can get more people here to see it live and possibly ask questions of my guests. Also, you can join me in my locals community at thereasonwelearn.locals.com for further conversation about all of these issues, as well as help with homeschooling and understanding what's going on in your kid's school at a more in-depth level. So let me introduce you to my guest. I'm very fortunate to have Going Godward here today. That is also her Twitter handle. We will refer to her today as Gigi. And it is her pseudonym. She's a social worker and an education advocate whose professional interests include access and school choice for refugee, immigrant, and low income populations, as well as children with unique classroom needs. She's a native Southerner residing above the Mason-Dixon line with her two sons and her dog. I was inspired to invite her here today because on this channel, I do a mix of talking about things that are, wrong with educational, initiatives and pedagogy and things like that. So there's a fair amount of alarm going on the channel. There's a fair amount of exploration of things that I don't like at a 10,000-foot level, perhaps, but sometimes the little people get lost in the mix. The students, we don't talk enough about them here or anywhere. And I was on Twitter the other day and I noticed she was talking about some of her students, some of the refugee students in particular. And it made me realize, I do not know a lot about this subject. I don't know what their specific needs are. I don't know how, things like inclusion and diversity are being handled when it comes to those. And, the least of these, as we say in the title, the students who really they have language needs, they have social emotional learning needs, they have academic needs, adjustment, everything, you name it. And we're not talking about them. We're not talking about them. We're talking a lot about issues up here and politics. So I invited Gigi to come and educate us about what she does. So welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. This is exciting. Anytime I get the opportunity to talk about the students I work with, I want to take advantage of that because I do think that I have in my caseload and just that I have worked with over the years kind of they don't really get noticed as much, I think, as your typical American born, I should say, student. So yeah, thank you.
You're very welcome. And we do have a large and increasing number of these students, right?
Correct.
So this is a going concern. And as most people who watch this channel know, I am a government monopoly education abolitionist. A lot of people think that means I just want to burn down the public schools. I don't. I just want to decentralize. I want to remove the federal government from the conversation, and I want us to craft more individualized or specialized solutions for different kinds of students and family stakeholders. And your student body would be, those students would be included in that. I'm certainly not interested in throwing anybody out to the wolves or to not have an education. But first, we need to understand what their needs are. So, what don't we know?
What don't we know? We don't know. I would say, like, collectively, American public education is not structured to support the needs of I'm going to use the term refugee mostly throughout this because that's the population I work with. And I just want to kind of distinguish refugee from immigrant. So refugees who arrive in the United States, they have a legal permanent status. So it's not like someone who's just crossed the southern border or something like that. The people who arrive with a refugee status have gone through extreme vetting processes from their country of origin to arrive in the United States. And barring any kind of felony conviction, they typically get to stay in the United States, appeal or apply for citizenship, and become naturalized citizens of the country. So when I'm talking about refugee children, I'm talking about specifically children of families who have received legal permanent status to be in this country from a country they fled, either mostly because of war. They've been driven out of their countries. There are some countries that I've worked with from the Horn of Africa that are basically enslaving their citizens, their populations, and so people have fled those countries to escape enslavement. So I'm going to use that term, and I just kind of wanted to give a definition so that people weren't confused.
I appreciate that. That
Yeah,
helps me too.
yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So the refugee students I work with are from all over the world, and the issue is they arrive here, and they can be a range of ages. But if they arrive as a school-aged student, they typically have not been in any kind of formal school setting ever. They've kind of been on the run, sometimes since, toddler age. And they've maybe been in 3 or 4 different countries, in refugee camps or places just of holding until they were assigned a resettlement country. So there may be some refugee camp schools. There may have been some type of schooling they've had, but also the chances of them going from one country to another country that spoke a different language. They've gone through maybe 2 or 3 different language changes in countries, and by the time they arrive in the United States, they've picked up a little bit of this language, a little bit of that language. They've not usually learned to read or write even in their first language. And so you have a 9 or 10-year-old that's coming from that situation, and obviously it's traumatic, going through all those changes, possibly losing one or both parents. They arrive, they're just put into an American school, American classroom. And while it's great to help them learn English, to be in a setting where there's English being spoken, 7 hours a day in an American classroom when you've come from what they've come from is just really not ideal in terms of learning. And we have no child left behind. So what happens is these children come, they have no formal education. They're pretty much just put in a classroom. They do get pulled for like ESL services. But it's mostly 7 hours a day sitting in an American classroom. And
Wow.
it would take a long time for them to really master the English language to the degree, a typical 10-year-old would, but they're passed on to 6th grade and 7th grade and 8th grade and 9th grade, having never mastered any of those skills. And they just kind of start falling in the cracks. And then they're labeled typically as a behavioral need. And there's this whole behavioral health side, when really they've not been given the resources for academic success, and they've not been given the resources for any kind of trauma-informed care or something like that they might need. And they've not really received any kind of assimilation implementation to help them just kind of navigate some American systems that we have. And I'm not saying they need to, when I say assimilate, I'm not saying they need to relinquish their former culture or language or anything like that.
Right.
But there are some American systems that, it's helpful for them to understand and know kind of how things work. So the issue is that American school system is just not geared to support these students. And we do have a lot. I live in a city where refugee students make up almost 5% of the entire district, which is kind of a lot. And my city takes in more refugees per capita than any city in the country.
Wow.
So we have a lot in my city. And so my city is unique in that way. So I'm probably seeing more issues than maybe somewhere in like rural Kentucky would see. But that's just my personal experience with the school system, with these students, where there are gaps in delivery of services, and they do just kind of fall by the wayside because we don't have the supports for them. And I don't think we're looking to find supports for them.
So they're just kind of thrown in the deep end.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And what I imagine this not only impacts them, but it probably impacts the other students as well in the classes, correct? I mean, if you're a student in a class and there are refugee students in your class, probably not the teachers, everybody's not really sure what to do, would seem.
Correct. So in my school, there is a larger population with certain from a certain country, and we don't have any language services for those children. We don't have someone on site who can readily translate. So the kids are translating for each other. And, you might be right in the middle of something, and a student in I know 2 students in 3rd grade, and they're in different classes, but they both speak the same language. And one teacher's borrowing another student to come in and translate for this new student who just arrived from this country. And, it does disrupt learning. It does disrupt, classroom.
Right.
It's just really kind of a mess, unfortunately,
Right.
and it does affect the other students who are there and who are having their learning time disrupted. And it's not the refugee children's fault. It's nobody's fault. It's just these are the consequences of it.
Well, I think, I don't know if fault's really the right word, but I think when you go all the way up the food chain to the people who are making policy about resettlement and assignment and, things like that, I think that we should be holding them accountable for doing a better job of planning.
Mhm,
So, for example, if let's say this decision is made at the federal level, I'm not really sure, but I'm going to guess that there's a heavy amount of that involvement.
mhm,
That I would think there ought to be some work done to make sure the services and the facilities and all the things are there in place to help these people, not just for their own good, but also for the community into which they'll be placed,
mhm,
because they're now going to be creating, and I don't like to use the word burden, but it's like you're creating a need,
mhm,
okay, of the school district that you can't just magically fill.
mhm,
It's going to take, like you said, somebody who speaks the language. You need translators. You need possibly this trauma care, the people who understand the cultural specifics of the place where the refugees came from. Now,
mhm.
you mentioned a story on Twitter about one such student, and I think this speaks to what you meant by assimilation, where the student came in with certain expectations based on his prior experience,
Mhm.
and he was labeled and you had to intervene. Can you tell us more about what missing? What was missed in translation of what the child really was trying to get across?
So, I feel like it needs a little bit of a backstory just to kind of
Oh,
let you know
sure.
how things develop. So, whenever families arrive, they are immediately put in contact with a resettlement agency, and those are very bureaucratic, and they typically do not have the support staff to resettle the families that are coming in at the rate they're coming in. So you've got maybe 2 or 3 resettlement caseworkers and maybe 3 families consisting of 30 people or something like that. I mean, it's crazy, and you might have a lot of school-aged children. And the goal is to just kind of get everybody plugged in as soon as possible, get them housing, get them a job, get the kids in school, get a doctor set up. And it's like rapid fire getting them resettled. I mean, it happens so quickly. So we got to get the kids enrolled in school as soon as possible. Then the parents can go to work all day because they need to get a job because they need to be able to support themselves. So in the process of getting kids enrolled in school as quickly as possible, there is this gap in gathering personal information about the student. It's mostly they're gathering information about their English skills, any formal schooling they've had, but they're not really going into what that formal schooling was like. They might just say, "Okay, yes, they went to 2nd grade." And then that's all they've had. But they don't really go into like what was that school experience like? What did they learn there? How many kids were there? How many teachers? Like and you may think, well, that doesn't really have an effect, but it does,
Oh
especially
no, it has a huge
yeah,
effect.
right, and the thread that you're talking about, I mean, this student came from a really horrible, war-torn country, a lot of conflict. Um, he has multiple siblings. Mom came alone with multiple multiple children. Um, he'd only been to maybe 2nd grade in his first country, but his experience in his first country was was a lot of physical abuse, a lot of corporal punishment for things that he couldn't control, like being late. I think a lot of parents have, a lot, I think they have a lot of power over where their children are later. So he would be corporally punished for being late. And it wasn't just like a SWAT, it was, physical abuse. I think we would probably call it physical abuse. And
Mhm.
that was his experience of schooling, unfortunately. So when he came to the States, he's thinking in his little, I guess he was like 9 at the time, his little 9-year-old mind, this is what school is gonna be like. I remember school being where I got beat up by my teachers for being late.
Right.
So that's what they're gonna do to me here. Because nobody's prepared him, and nobody at the school was thinking he's had this horrible experience. They've not even thought to ask that. They've just kind of expected he would know how to be in an American classroom. And he was very aggressive. And there was this huge language barrier. He couldn't even, he couldn't speak English. They couldn't speak his language. And so there's this huge language barrier. We don't have language services there to interpret what he's trying to say, what he's trying to communicate. I mean, any child, any person would feel defensive in those situations. So he ended up, and I said in the thread, he ended up going into an alternative school, which actually was, I think, okay for him. He loved it there. The only thing is he missed being around children. He's very extroverted and really needs that, being around friends and peers and interacting with others. So he was begging to come back to the regular classroom. So they went through this. I mean, it took almost a year to get him out of the alternative school and back into a regular classroom. And this time coming into the regular classroom, there were many more supports for him, but I think they were still anticipating possible aggression. Still, no one had asked him about his prior experience. 2.5 years has gone by, and no one has asked him, what was school like for you there? What was your experience? Why don't you like school? What is making you feel aggressive? Nobody asked him those questions, to my knowledge, because when I talked to the dean of students about it, about the time that I spent with him and him sharing things with me, she said that makes total sense, because the first time I interacted with him, I thought he thinks I'm going to beat the crap out of him. Like, she perceived that, but she didn't do anything about it. She didn't dig into that at all. So that's just one of like a million stories I could tell.
Do you think they don't ask because they don't think of it? Or do you think they don't ask because somewhere in the subconscious is this inhibition? Like, if I ask and I uncover information, I might have to do something that I won't have the power to do, or like, in other words, that the incentives are somewhere there, like in people's minds to don't cost us money. I mean, not to put it any other way, but when you start talking about children with special needs, what I've experienced is administrators in particular are loath to ask, loath to diagnose, or loath to like do any kind of diagnostics or inquiry, because they're afraid of what they're going to find, because then they're duty bound to do something about it.
Honestly, I think there's probably a little bit of both. I think in her situation, it probably was just, and I hate using this term because in my field, it gets so overused, but just some cultural incompetence, just, not really thinking about it, like not really thinking, oh, he might have come from an area that was full of conflict and maybe he had some horrible experiences. But I do think you're right in that sometimes they don't really want to get to the root of the problem. I use this phrase all the time, or this quote from Thoreau, and it's, for every 1,000 hacking at leaves or branches, one's hacking at the root, or something to that effect. And so I'm seeing all these issues with these kids, and I feel like nobody is addressing the root issue. And that's something that I have taken upon myself to find a solution to and go a different route. The first time that I've been involved in education for over a decade. I've done kind of like education consulting. I've been a private tutor. So I've raised 2 children of my own. So I've kind of been in the education world for a while, but refugee education really came like in front of me when I was resettling a family from the Horn of Africa. I will not say the country, but it's a really high conflict country. It's a terrible situation. They had one daughter. She was 14. When she arrived here, she had never been to school. She had never learned to read or write in her first language. Like, if you had put her first language in front of her, she wouldn't have been able to read it. And she was thrown at 14 years old as a freshman into a giant high school with like 2,000 students.
Oh my God.
No supports. She ended up getting on the wrong bus going home. Like, there were just all these issues. So just imagine being a 14-year-old girl in a brand new country. You don't look like anybody else. You don't sound like anybody else. You don't know how to read or write, even in your first language, much less English. You're sitting 7 hours a day in an American classroom in a Title I school that has a ton of behavioral issues, that kind of thing. Can you imagine?
No. And all of this is so ironic to me because, I spend so much time researching and talking about, all these diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives and, culturally relevant pedagogy and all of this stuff. And what I find so fascinating is that there's this push to go into classrooms where there is no evidence of a problem.
Mhm.
Okay,
Mhm.
there's really not much evidence that
Right.
something is, suburban schools, where it's like we've got to like address all these alleged problems. And then you're not the first person who's told me, I mean, about refugees, yes, but about specific, issues in more, Title I schools, schools with high populations of VLs, English learners, where there's just total cluelessness, like the
Mhm.
same
Mhm.
this focus on cultural relevance and cultural competence is missing. And it's
Mhm.
just like bizarre to me that and it also makes it difficult to fight because there's truth in what people say
Mhm.
that we do need to be culturally competent as a pluralistic society where we have immigrants, we have refugees, we have all kinds of people, and children are coming and going into our schools. We can't just treat them like they're all native born and speak English and are
Mhm.
growing up the same way. That's just common sense, right? But it doesn't necessarily follow that we then need to go to the, native born American children and teach a bunch of stuff, right? Like
Mhm.
and that seems to be the focus is on changing people who are not needing the change
Mhm.
and ignoring the kids who
Mhm.
desperately need this help
Mhm.
and the
Right.
teachers who serve them and the
Mhm.
social workers who serve them and all of those
Right.
people.
Right.
So that's what's so weird when you were saying like, there's a cultural competency problem. And so there might be people in the audience going, see, we are culturally incompetent. I'm like, yes, but we're like putting the pieces in the wrong
Right.
parts of the puzzle. Like,
Right.
anyway.
Yes. Yes. So that's what I see, and also I just wanna, like, I know I want this to be about education, but I also wanna say this, and I brought this up in one of my grad school classes last week. You know, like I said, my city resettles at a higher refugees at a higher rate than any city in the country
Mhm.
and take in more per capita. And it is not compassionate and it is not kind to host these people, to bring them into and to say you're hospitable
Right.
and not have the supports. And if you're going to put them in the schools, you don't have the supports there. And also, frequently, and I hate to say this, and again, this is just my experience in my city and resettling families here. Um, Typically, refugees get put in the worst housing. They're in the slummiest parts of the city. I remember one of the first two houses that I went and took families to and resettled them. I had not seen them prior because that it wasn't, I didn't find housing, I just took them to the housing.
Right.
I remember saying, "I think the refugee camp would have been better than this." Like, I just thought it was the slummiest, most decrepit place I had ever seen, and that we were putting people who were coming here for safety and
Right.
for, something improved, we put them in a barely standing shack.
Oh my
And
God.
and so I just say things like, yes, it's compassionate to bring them here, to get them a place for safety, but it's not compassionate if you don't have the resources or the community support to help them thrive.
What would be the alternative? So, I mean, I agree with you, but then I think, um, you know, is it not what somebody in the comments is saying here, I'm a refugee from Vietnam. I came to America in 1979 right after the
Mhm,
war. The elementary school I attended was bad, but to me and my parents, the school was better than the alternative. Now
mhm,
that's 1979, so things are still, different as far as schooling and
mhm, mhm,
population and so forth. But um what what would we do if we don't have the supports? And I agree with you that it seems cruel to just be like, "Sure, we'll take you," and then just dump you in a corner somewhere.
mhm.
But is it better possibly than the alternative? Or what would happen to them if we didn't take them even without the supports?
Can you repeat that last part? I'm sorry.
What would happen to them if we said, "Nope, we don't have the," because I've
Okay, I see what
seen
you're saying. Yes.
yeah, I've seen situations in the past where people have argued, like mostly politicians. Okay.
Mhm,
So in fairness, it's been mostly politicians who've said, we can't take more people because we don't have the support. We don't have the resources. The word they
mhm,
usually use is
mhm,
resources. People hear money, then people say you're greedy and
mhm,
selfish,
mhm,
right?
mhm.
But I'm trying to have a more nuanced ear and think, well, I mean, money doesn't buy everything. Like you can't
Mhm.
manufacture people with
Right.
expertise out of thin air, and
Yeah.
you can't manufacture high quality, low cost housing. So,
Mhm,
even if with money, you can't just
mhm.
snap your fingers and do
Right.
it.
Right.
So,
So I think this is also like a local issue. I'm reading our commenter from Vietnam, and I think it is. I think it's like a local issue. I know my city. I can say at this point. I mean, we're taking in a lot of Afghans right now, and we don't have like housing and education support for everyone that's coming in. So I think if there are cities who are taking in refugees, um, wonderful. But I think it's like a local decision about how they're gonna manage and support these. So maybe this person who maybe when they arrived, they were in a city that there were, there was sufficient support for them, and that was their experience. I'm speaking from my city presently because we do have so many and how my city has managed that.
right.
Um, so I'm sure in many instances it is better, no doubt, than the alternative. But also I wanna say about this as well. I've resettled people from probably 30 plus countries, maybe more than that.
Mm,
And personality and ability to assimilate is huge in their success here. Huge. And I have two Burmese families that I know. And one family, and they knew each other. They're not related, but they know each other from being in Burma and then coming here. And one has done exceptionally well, has assimilated, children are doing great, family's doing great. I think they've even started their own business. And then I have another who has really, really struggled to assimilate, to it's just been really, really hard. And I remember he said when his brother was gonna come from Burma, he said, "Don't come, it's too hard." So I think sometimes the American I think the culture, I think the way of life here is so fast paced and it's so competitive, I guess. There's so many things and there's just this expectation that you're just supposed to know how to do things when you arrive. Um, and a lot of it depends on like how well you can adapt and assimilate. And some
right.
family, maybe this Vietnamese family here that in the comments, they may have had really good adaptation and assimilation skills and were
Hmm.
able to really make the most of their experience. But there are many who get here and they're like, this is terrible. I have had many families, moms who brought their children over to
Right.
safety say, I'm going to go back to my country of origin. Once their children are grown, like they'll have children that are like getting old enough to be on their own, and they will apply to go back to their country of origin. They will never stay here. They want to go back to their country of origin.
Interesting.
Mhm. Yeah.
Have things improved in their countries of origin, or they just are like, I'd rather take my chances in my country of origin than
Yes.
be here?
Yes.
Wow.
Mhm. Mhm.
Interesting. Now, I have heard, by the way, that that was true all along. So, in other words, if anybody's listening and thinking like, "Oh, that's because we've become blah blah blah," it's like, no,
Mm-mm.
I've actually heard even from my grandfather told me
Mhm.
things about relatives
Mhm.
of his who came from Russia,
Mhm.
even though they were persecuted. Some of them
Mhm.
wanted to go back. I mean,
Mhm.
that was always the case. Not everybody liked it here.
Right, right. And
Yeah.
that's I think part of when you say like it was better, than the alternative or whatever. So much of it is based on perspective, where you landed, your ability to adapt and assimilate, and maybe your experience was great and you could think this is better than the alternative. But I've had many who think it's too hard and they start making plans to go back to their country of origin once their children are grown.
Right. Right.
Um, so just to go back and track to education, for me, and what I've seen, I think there needs to be something put in place if we're going to take children into the public school who are refugees. There needs to be some type of program, some type of transitional school. This is what I've been working on at the local level. There needs to be something put in place where children can come in, they can have 1 to 2 years based on their needs, of transition before they ever enter into, like, a typical American classroom, where they can learn the language. There can be some assessment on where they are academically. If there are any delays, that can be assessed during that time. And they can also receive trauma-informed care if there's any kind of counseling. I mean, unfortunately, sadly, I have children who have seen their parents murdered in front of them. They have. And they've never been able to talk about that or work through that. So having someone who is qualified or cares deeply to minister, to serve these children in that capacity, and then also provide academic supports for at least a year or two before they're put into the public school classroom is necessary.
And that's not available now. That's something you're working on. And so that's what you're speaking of when you say school choice. So you would like to see that become more the norm as an option for. Now, would this be an option for the parents, or do you think this would be more like, this is what that we just do when we resettle, we put them in the alternative school? Would they have the option? Let's say the kids were educated or spoke English. Would you still think they would need this, or could they go into the schools?
Yeah, that was something I thought of. I mean, there would be children whose parents maybe did speak English prior to coming here, and they've heard English their whole lives. Maybe they were able to go as many grades as they could in their first country, in their country of origin, and they may not need a 2-year transition.
Right.
So I think it would just be I think there would have to be assessment involved about what children need, and like I said, some children might need 2 years, some might just need 1 year, some might just need 6 months. Who knows? But there just needs to be something intermediate there. There needs to be some kind of piece between bringing them here and then just throwing them in a public school classroom.
Right.
Yes.
That makes so much sense. And like, one of the reasons I asked you to come here is I realized reading your post that I drew a complete blank when I tried to think about what do they do? Like, I knew refugees are coming, and I'm like, well, where do they go? What do they do with them? We hear a lot about resettlement in terms of what cities they're going to or what areas of the country, and that they are then given, housing or whatever. But I don't think anybody's talking about what's happening to them when they go into school. And then what does that do to the general, makeup of the school? Right. So even, the commenter is saying he agree. I think I'm sorry if I'm misgendering. I agree with the transition school. My elementary school was essentially a transition school, since 90% of the students were refugees. So, possibly, but I don't know. Maybe you can share with us in the comments. Did you have special care there, or was it like, here's the American elementary school, you just happen to all be from Vietnam, right? Like, because because I think that's what is the problem, is even if you had in your school a large percentage who are refugees, without translators, without people doing assessments and trauma care, it would be a significant hurdle for them and for the teachers, because I would think too that teachers would need special training. Not every teacher is going to be adept, at this kind of teaching.
Right. That's what I was also going to say too. When I think about a transition school, there are many teachers who do not have that ELL cert or ESL cert, not ELL, ESL cert. And not that you have to have an ESL cert to be able to, be an ESL teacher or anything like that. I'm not going to get into the whole certification thing. But they haven't had any, real training or, know how to interact with a different language and what teaching that, looks like. So having a transition school where all the teachers are kind of, I hate using the word passionate, but who are interested in this population, who see it as a challenge, who have, who are more visionary, who have ideas of like how we can serve them during this time, what education can look like. And then when I thought about my transition school, I wanted it to work in tandem with the public school with other private schools here. We have
Right.
we have a few Catholic schools here. We have some other like classical Christian schools, and I just wanted the transition school to work independently as its own school, but in tandem with schools so that there could be a smooth transition wherever the parents wanted them to go after that.
So real choice.
Yes,
So
yes,
they
yes.
could pick well, because to your point, some of the students have a personality that lends itself well. They're very outgoing, and that lends itself well to one environment perhaps, and then others might be a little shyer or a little more serious, or maybe extremely academically gifted, who knows,
Mhm, mhm, mhm,
So or they might have special needs in the other direction. So they
mhm.
really I think the transition is great, but I like your idea better that it would be give them more choices after that, so they can which, by the way, all students should have, in my
Mhm,
opinion. I'm
mhm,
sure
mhm,
yours too,
mhm,
that
mhm.
it's not just the least of these, but that these students should have also. Why should they be consigned to one choice?
Yes.
Um and I think another ingredient that would be nice would be teachers who actually like this country.
Mhm. Right. Yes, yes,
I
yes.
mean, I know we don't talk about it a lot, but that's something I've seen in schools in general. A lot of teachers who really openly hate the United States of America. And I think that's particularly bad if you're exposed to students who've been resettled here. I think it's tantamount to abuse,
Mhm,
because I mean, the kid they didn't have a choice. They were brought here, they were settled here. Their family itself may not have had a choice. They might have said, "This is where we're sending you," of the
mhm.
countries that.
Correct. Mhm,
And so, wouldn't it be nice to be received and educated by people who are not just happy you're here, but happy you're here because here is a good place to be?
mhm, mhm,
And
mhm.
I don't think the first thing we want to convey to new residents is, bummer. You just came to this horribly oppressive place.
Right, right. No, it's absolutely true. And I think that and that's something I feel is unfortunate whenever because I worked for a resettlement agency before I was in a school setting, then I was in a refugee resettlement setting, and now I'm back in an education setting. So I've kind of seen both sides of everything, and of in terms of education, refugees, and resettlement. Um, when refugees arrive here, there's not like a welcome to America. This is about America.
Right.
This is why it's great. This is why we're glad you're here because these are going to be your experiences. What typically happens is there's a rush to get them into jobs. And so there's like job training. But it's like Americans expect you to be on time. Americans expect you to have clean clothes. Americans expect it's like that. So it's
Oh, but we're not supposed to teach that, because that's what?
they do. I mean, the resettlement agents have to because the environments that they're placing them in for employment are a lot of times like food services and things like that, where you have to abide by certain, rules of cleanliness and tidiness and order. So they have to be informed. This is the standard. And,
Right.
um, if your shift starts at 1 p.m. and you don't show up at 1 p.m., then
Yeah.
everything gets messed up, so you must arrive at 1 PM and you cannot
Right.
leave until, 9 PM, and so many of them have lived in transition for so long, they've never had any kind of schedule or order or expectation, and not that I'm not saying that's bad or anything, but there is
Well,
a lot there's a lot of that that has to be learned.
yeah, I think people who are accustomed to getting up at a specific time in the morning because they've got to be somewhere, because things are on a schedule. If
Mhm,
you haven't had that in your life at all, or you
mhm,
wake up in a home where the parents don't go to a job, so that nobody's getting up at a specific time, and the hours are all, people are staying up till 1 in the morning, and people are, or whatever. There's just no
mhm,
routine. Um, it can be extremely difficult to get into a routine. One of the things I've heard from teachers and parents at post COVID
mhm,
is that getting their school age kids back into a routine where you've
mhm,
got to get up at a time to go be at the bus, to go to school, to, in
right,
person, especially for the younger kids who maybe had, 1 year of school or a couple years of school. they're
Mhm.
struggling
Right.
because even their parents weren't going to work.
Right.
Like, everybody
Right.
was just on this kind of free for all of, I'm at home and, we just do things whatever, and it's really challenging to get people to see the value in that. The younger they are, the harder it is.
Something else that I see a lot of, and it's just unfortunate. And again, I think all this could be solved if there was some kind of like 2-year transition assimilation thing
Right.
for refugee children. But in the transition that they've had going from, multiple countries to the United States, there's not been this routine, there's not been a schedule or something like that. And also, different countries have different views of education.
Yep.
So they may have come from a country where education for girls is totally not valued.
Right.
And suddenly they're not sending their, 10-year-old to school, the 10-year-old girl to school because at 10 years old, they don't go to school in their country. And then you have truancy issues with this family.
My goodness.
So we've got like truancy issues because there's just not that, I guess, they don't see the importance, I guess, of sending children to school, or maybe they think they only need to go 3 months a year or something like that. So just trying to get some buy-in for these families is often a challenge.
Right.
Yes.
Wow. So you also need, that the outreach for the families to convey the importance of school
Mhm.
and to, get them to buy in and participate in that. There are a lot of things that, like I said, most of us don't think about.
Mhm.
We just don't
Right.
think about it. But that's why I wanted to have you on because it's a, and, so tell us more about your project, your specific project that you're working on to get this going, because it's a great idea. I mean, I'm 100% behind you,
Mhm.
and agree with you that there needs to be some kind of transition. How do we make it happen?
So funding, I mean, really finding money is like the hardest thing. And also just generating support because you and just the work that you do, people are so taken captive by like it has to be an American public school. Like that's what education has to look like. They cannot think what education could be or should be outside of American public education.
Right.
And so there's a whole lot of trying to convince people it does not have to be this way. You do not have to take refugees as soon as they arrive and put them in an American public school classroom. What could look different? How could education look different? It really is getting people to see that education can be different. It doesn't have to look like this. So first of all, gathering support and gathering like-minded people who say, "You know what? You're right. It doesn't have to be this way." And then also raising awareness that there is a real issue. My whole grad school project has been on this. Um, kind of showing a need for this in my city because we do have so many refugee students in our district that are underserved.
Right.
So it's gathering
Now
support.
I finally found an actual definition of underserved.
Yeah, they really
Because,
are underserved.
people
They
toss
really
that
are.
word around all the
Yes.
time,
Yeah.
and they're talking about American students,
Mhm.
and I'm thinking to myself, but, unless you're talking specifically about a special needs student who's literally being deprived services, to just refer to someone being underserved because of the color of their skin. Let's say, for
Mhm.
example, I'm like,
Mhm.
that's not what underserved means. Like,
Right.
underserved, you can measure it.
Mhm.
And
Right.
what you're describing like, I can see the size and shape and scope of the lack of service that's
Mhm.
being provided here.
Right.
And that now the word means something. It's not
Right.
just a word that people are tossing around. So,
Yeah.
that could be part of the problem too, is that people are getting sort of like eye rolling, almost numb or desensitized to the words that you need to use. The vocabulary that
Mhm.
would
Mhm.
apply to the very real needs that these kids have
Mhm.
is being overgeneralized and overused to where it's not needed.
Mhm.
And so now when you come in and say we have an underserved population, we're like, oh yeah, you and everybody else. Like, no, I
Right,
really
right, right,
do.
right. Right, and I know, and that's so unfortunate. I was saying something about this, but another piece of terminology, a few days ago, like, it's really unfortunate that words do get used and used in the wrong context and overused so that I can't really talk about them anymore. But there really is, excuse me, an underserved population of refugee students in districts that are weighted down with all kinds of needs. I mean, my school alone, 20%, 20, 1 in 5 students have an IEP. Wow. 1 in 5. And just scale back
But they have the IEP because they were thrown into something that's like way ahead of where they should be. They don't like an IEP, in my opinion, ought to be because someone has a delay or there's like a specific learning disability, not I don't speak English.
Right. Well, here's
And
the
everybody else
funny
does.
thing. Right, here's the funny thing. A lot of my refugee kids don't have IEPs. Well, first of all, IEPs take forever to implement. I mean, you have to have the school psych has to eval, you have to have teacher evals, you have to have all these people giving their input on whether a child even needs an individualized education plan for all those people who don't live in the world of acronyms. I feel like I need to
Right.
say it's an individualized education plan. Um, it's a huge process to even get one.
Right.
But my thought is, and this is like even scaling back from refugees, if you have a school where 20% of your students have individualized education plans, maybe your whole system is messed up if you're
You
having to
think?
accommodate that many
Yeah.
people.
I'm
That's what
thinking,
I'm like.
yeah.
I'm like, okay, well, maybe it's actually not the kids. Maybe it's actually the system. Maybe it's the machine. Maybe it's the complex. I mean, that's how my thinking is. I'm like, okay, this should be a red flag to you if 20% of your students have to have
Right.
special accommodations.
Well, then you have to start asking, like, why are they all in the same room at all?
Yeah, in
Like,
a school like that, I mean, when you have 1 in 5, I mean, you're gonna have multiple in a classroom because yeah, right, like, why are they in the classroom? Oh,
why are they mainstreamed at all? Like, I
yeah,
mean, this is just and like you said, that to me is a huge red flag. It's also a very expensive way
mhm,
of delivering the education.
mhm, mhm.
So, what this makes me think too, you said it's money's a problem, money's a problem. It's like, I bet money's not a problem. It's allocation of
That's
funds
true.
that is the
Mhm, mhm.
problem.
Right. And this sounds so I'm sure this is probably not accurate, but this is just my perception. So it's really interesting because it's like we're gonna keep saying we're gonna keep making these individualized education plans for students, but we're not gonna look at the actual problem. We're just gonna keep like hiring staff and hiring specialists and things like that to address all these issues. But we're not really going to step back and look at what the real problem is. I mean, heaven forbid we give them a choice to go to a school where they can actually get the supports they need.
Right.
Heaven forbid we do that. Let's just keep hiring staff too.
Well, okay, now the little conspiracy theorist in me comes out. It's not conspiracy, but so many problems that I've seen in education can be traced back to incentives in the wrong place.
Mhm, mhm.
And so if I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, well, as you just said, go hire more staff. Who benefits? So
Mhm,
I'm always
mhm.
asking the question, because we know it's not the kids. So who benefits? Teachers unions,
Right,
maybe.
right.
And, we know that the way schools are currently funded, it's based on head counts
Mhm,
and enrollment numbers and
mhm,
butts and seats,
mhm,
and that funding then pays salaries
mhm,
of teachers and administrators
mhm,
and so
mhm.
on and so forth.
Right.
So the way that we're funding this system is creating these perverse incentives that do not serve the children.
Mhm.
That's
Correct.
that's been my assessment. It's part of why I am for abolishing this behemoth, or at
Mhm,
least undermining it by opening separate
mhm,
solutions,
mhm.
because we're not serving the kids.
Right.
Bottom line. That's they are not cogs in a machine
Mhm,
to be exploited so
mhm,
that people can have jobs.
mhm, mhm, mhm.
That's not why they're there.
And it really I can't speak to education 20, 30, 40 years ago, but I can tell you now, in my experience, it is really starting to feel and I'm not saying public education. I'm not saying this about private ed, but about
Right.
public education. It is looking more and more like a jobs program than an actual, like, way of
I'm
educating
glad
the
you
public.
said it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I've
Yeah.
tweeted about it before. Like, it is
Yeah.
it's such like a jobs program at this point.
Yeah.
And I feel that way. I came from some nonprofit backgrounds, and I feel the same way about nonprofit in that it's just such like a jobs program. It's not really doing anything effective in solving any social issues. Is public education really educating anybody anymore? It really all feels like a jobs program rather than
For adults.
right. And I talk about this all the time because the education system has gotten so bureaucratic. Um, the iron law of bureaucracy, and you can
Right.
apply this to the public school system because it has become so bureaucratic. You have a group of people who are dedicated to the mission of the organization. So, like in education, you do have teachers and you do have administrators who do deeply want to educate children. They do. And they love the children and they love their job and they're good at it. But you have many more who are dedicated to just expanding the organization, to just making it bigger, to employing more people, and they've lost track of the mission. So in bureaucracy, you have two people. You have the people who are dedicated to the mission, and you have people who are dedicated to just growing the organization.
Right.
And I think
Because
education
it's
has
like
the
the too
latter.
big to fail concept.
Yeah, and I think education has become the latter. I think it's too big.
Right.
Mhm.
And we now have seen some states talking about passing laws. I think New Jersey is doing this. They want to pass a law to allow for consolidation,
Mm,
for more consolidation, making school
mm,
districts bigger.
mm.
And I
Oh
I
my.
can't think of a worse idea. I mean,
Mm-mm, mm-mm,
decentralization is the answer, right? The
mhm,
closer you
mhm,
are to the people you're serving,
mhm,
the better everything is. There's
mhm,
less make work
mhm,
for all of the intermediaries to get to the
mhm,
decision makers at the
mhm,
tippy top. I mean,
mhm,
it's just but that seems to be the direction because I do think what they're aiming for ultimately, by they, I mean the Department of Education and the teachers unions, is to make the federal government the ultimate arbiter of what's going on.
mhm, mhm, mhm.
And so, I think school choice is not just a matter of urgent need for students like yours, but I think the more we support it and the more we actually build these things,
Mhm.
then it will be harder to stop that process,
Yes.
right?
I
So
I saw this transition school program as kind of like I felt like it was gonna I don't know what the word would be, just like kind of interrupt the system in the city that I'm in. Like
right.
it stops the school system from just taking in these students, not serving them well, passing them on, and it allows parents to have a choice about where their children can go for at least 2 years. I mean, I would love for it to be like a K-12 school that was like a charter school or a private school or something, but I had to scale it back a lot. Originally, it was gonna be this K-12 school. We're gonna give preference to refugees because we have so many. I mean, it was just gonna be this whole thing. And the more I got into it and the more I started working on it, I had to scale it back a lot to something that was realistic, attainable, fundable, and it became this 2-year transition school program. One of the things in the comment I'm looking here, Feng Li, I hope I'm saying that right, said that the school hired a couple of refugee parents who knew a little bit of English to help the kids. They weren't certified. Thinking back, they knew very little. Again, they were better than nothing. Okay, I want to say this because my thought about this, or what I'm working on with this transition school, is it's almost like a job opportunity too for parents who may have been teachers. I resettled people who were teachers in their village school where they were before, and it was really hard for them because they loved teaching, they loved the children, but of course they couldn't teach in the United States because they didn't speak the language, they didn't have the proper certification. But providing an opportunity for them to use those skills in a classroom, speaking their language and speaking English because they spoke English as well.
Right.
Working in a school, like providing them an opportunity to engage with the refugee community. I want parents, I want former teachers from other countries to come in and be a part of that school. I don't want it to
Mhm.
be just like American teachers who only know English to come in. I want it to be something that involves parents, involves former teachers from other countries, um, yeah, that's a great example, like having parents who can come in, who can volunteer, who can tutor, former teachers. That's what I want it to be. I don't want it to be just this, like, people like you and I going in. I want it to involve the whole refugee community.
Right. Right. Exactly.
Mhm.
And I think that's a great idea. Like you said, as long as they want to be there and you have, you're bringing in people who are, I'm not gonna say qualified, but there's some
Right.
connection. There's
Yes,
some
correct.
reason why
Yes.
they would be there.
Yes.
But even if they weren't coming in as teachers and so forth, I mean, if you still have like a parent group that is, involved and can provide, feedback and things like that, I
Mhm.
think that would be really helpful. Eh, You know, but it has to be led, like the whole thing, like I said, it has to be led by people who really are enthusiastic about America. And,
Mhm.
like,
Right.
about
Yes.
because especially given what you're saying about some people just find it too hard, um, I think getting used to any new place. I lived in another country for a year,
Mm.
and it was a European country, but they didn't speak, English everywhere I went.
Mhm.
And I went over there by myself, and I didn't know anybody when I got there. I was studying in a program, but I didn't know any of the other people.
Mhm. Mhm.
And, I remember feeling, like, really out of place and feeling, how difficult it was, but it really did nudge me along and keep me going that the program I went to for my classes
Mhm.
was staffed by people who were really enthusiastic about teaching me about their country.
Mhm.
They were
Mhm.
really
Mhm.
enthusiastic about, you know and not in an arrogant way,
Mhm.
not in a way like, "We're better than you," but it was more like, "Oh, we're so glad you're here. Let us show you, what how we do things, and
Right.
and it's gonna be really neat, and we're gonna
Yeah.
take you here and take." I mean, they would take us on these little field trips.
Mhm.
I mean, I was in college, but still, it'd
Mhm.
take us on a field trip because, as an example, this is in Austria. People don't socialize the same way. One of the
Mhm.
things we don't think about in this country is the way we socialize and the way people in other countries socialize is very different.
Mhm.
And we have a tendency to have people over to our house and have parties or get-togethers at home. Well, over there, they don't really do that. You go out and you meet at it's either like the beer hall or the coffee house, depending how many people you're meeting up with. If you're meeting
Mhm.
up with more than 2 or 3 people, you're probably going to the local pub, like, it's not a pub, but like a beer hall or sort of restaurant, Gaststube.
Mhm. Mhm.
And there are even tables there where regulars go, and you're not supposed to sit there. Like, if you're not one of the regulars, even if it's empty, you don't sit at that table. So there's little cultural norms
Mhm.
that I wouldn't have known. But the way it was introduced to me was like, this is going to be really fun. We're going to introduce you so you can be like a native, so that you
Mhm.
can feel comfortable and blend in. And 6 months into living there, in addition to having improved my language skills dramatically because it
Mhm.
was pretty immersive,
Mhm.
um, people were mistaking me for a native. Now, it didn't hurt that I looked like, like I could blend in looks
Right.
wise,
Right. Right.
but, there were a group of American students on a train talking among themselves about they were confused about something, whatever, and they were standing right near me and did not have any idea that I was American
Amazing.
or that I wasn't Austrian.
Right.
And I know that came from the fact that my teachers and all the people that were helping us, and this was just for 1 year, we were gonna go home. We
Mhm.
didn't
Mhm.
have to assimilate, right?
Mhm.
And yet they took it upon themselves to say, "You're gonna have a much better time and be much more comfortable if we show you how to socialize, how to buy things at the store,
Yep.
how to, board the train, how to do these things like a native."
Yes. And that's so huge. When I was working in resettlement, um, I saw this huge, like, gap in how we were helping them to navigate American systems. And when I say systems, that's probably a poor word, like going to the grocery store, that kind of thing. I remember I took a group of Burmese, people who had just arrived here, and we went to Walmart, and we learned to shop at Walmart, and we learned to do self-checkout.
Yeah,
Like, things like that, you just think we take for granted because we're so used to using self-checkout, but,
right.
they had never used self-checkout, so and for me, that was probably one of my favorite things I ever did was like teaching them how to do things like
Right.
that, taking them out because it's exciting for them. It's exciting for
Right.
me because I'm like, okay, look, this is amazing. You get to just check out by yourself. You don't even have to go online, kind of thing.
Right.
And I would just get so excited. Just sharing little things like that with them. And many of them had never had a refrigerator and they don't know how to use a stove and things like that. And just teaching them how to do those things, going to the DMV, getting like an ID, things like that, their documentation, just all kinds of little things like that. I had never ridden a public transportation in my city, and they had never ridden public transportation. So we all just got on the bus together. And I said, this is my first time too. So we're all just going to do this together. So they didn't feel like, oh, she knows everything. I think it was actually comforting that we were just kind of learning it together.
Yeah.
So same with school.
Yeah.
I mean, this can just move right into like the whole school thing. It would be wonderful if we are going to bring children into a public school classroom that they have like a buddy, that they have somebody that is kind of with them for 2 weeks when they first get settled in. So, I know that especially in the grades, like I would say 3rd and higher, that children love that kind of thing. They love to have that little task of helping and kind of partnering with someone and showing them how to do things that gives them a sense of, confidence and pride, and they're able to teach something. And then it gives the person who's new an opportunity to have a friend, to they're
Right.
kind of associated with someone at that point. And then other peers start to see, oh, these two people, they go together and they're friends. And so this person is okay. And we can bring them into our, social group.
Right.
So there are just so many things that could happen in the public school currently to ease the transition, to encourage thriving for these students they're just not done. They're
Right.
kind of ignored, and they're just expected to just mull around and just follow everybody else and kind of figure their way through. And it's really unfortunate because I'm seeing a trend of these students um, really not flourishing over time, and not just
Right.
receiving academic supports, language supports.
Well, and then they're
Social.
more vulnerable to the influences that, people are saying, well, these negative outcomes are a function of, and they come up with some big ism.
Right.
And, what it sounds to me like is their bureaucracy is what they are experiencing.
Mhm.
Systemism.
Yes, it's
or
true.
or it's some whatever you want to call it, statism.
Mhm,
Just
mhm,
something where it's saying, there's a giant bureaucracy in charge of all this, and we're going to do it one way for everybody. And then when it fails, because wow, that wasn't predictable at all, but when it fails, guess who gets blamed?
mhm,
Everybody outside the system.
right.
And I'm seeing this with education. It's like society, where, is racist and
Mhm,
this and that and the other. And it's like, is it society or is it this system? Is it this
mhm,
closed system?
mhm,
Because when you are able, as you've seen, to work with these kids individually, or you're able to put them in a private school, like some kids have managed to get into Catholic schools or whatever, or when you're able to put them into some other setting, they do thrive, or they
mhm,
at least succeed well enough to be self-sufficient, to go on and make a life for themselves. Whereas when we see places where they rely almost exclusively on the system, that's where we have
mhm,
the biggest problems.
mhm, mhm.
But I don't see
100%.
anyone pointing at it. It's like everywhere but us is
Yes,
at fault.
yes. Well, and I'm just gonna take it back to, like, American students for just a second. In the school that I'm in, I could seriously talk about this all day, but it's
We'll
just
have to come back and
yeah,
talk about
it just is, but I have many students because 'cause I'm in a Title I school, so I have,
Can you
every child.
explain to people what Title One means? Because
So
I've
Title
learned that
One
the
typically,
audience doesn't
okay,
know
so
all the terms.
Title One is like is a school that's designated for like low income families only. So every child that is in the school is below the poverty line. And schools like that receive special funding because they're serving low income students. So like everybody's there is on free and reduced lunch. Um, everybody there is below the poverty line, and they receive special funding for being a Title I school. I don't know all the
Gotcha.
ins and outs of it, but that's kind of the gist of it.
Right.
So everybody that is in my school is below the poverty line. And I have many, many students, and I've tweeted about this before. So if people here are listening who have seen my Twitter, I'm sorry that I'm repeating myself. But I have many students who are in 4th and 5th grade that cannot write sentences, that cannot spell, that cannot read, cannot put punctuation. And it's, of course, everybody's fault except the school's fault. I mean, they pass these students along. They don't receive proper instruction. Anyway, so
I'm not obviously surprised as what I talk about all day, every day. I have been trying to tell people because they can't seem to believe it. They're like, but they're in school. And like, yeah, they go to a building.
Right.
And increasingly what's happening is they are warehoused in that building.
Yes.
And there are motions that people are going through that look like teaching, maybe kind of, but they've moved far away from instruction, what I would call instruction. And it's more like the kids are leading themselves half the time through a Chromebook or whatever. And they're just not getting, even students who don't have IEPs, they don't have 504 plans or other kinds of special needs. They're just kind of like, go to class and do the things.
Yes. I have one student, and I know I've talked with other like friends and educators about this one student. I see him a lot. He's in my caseload. He's got a lot of social emotional stuff that goes on. So I see him individually, and he's not a refugee child. He's just an American kid.
Right.
But it's very interesting. He and I, when we talk and we meet, we have very like intellectually stimulating conversations. I mean, he is able to engage about topics. He's very articulate. We talk about bees a lot. He loves to talk about bees. We talk about bees. And he's able to talk about those things intelligently.
Mm-hmm.
Cannot read. He's in 5th grade and he cannot read and he cannot
So
write.
we know he's smart. He's not been taught how to read. And this is the case time and time again. I cannot tell you how many kids I tutor who I don't have a big, roster at the moment, but I've, tutored ongoing for the past, 30 years, different numbers of kids. And increasingly they are kids who don't need a tutor. They need a teacher.
Exactly.
They've not been taught the material in the first place.
Yes, exactly.
So I'm not dealing with a
100%.
student who is having trouble because they don't understand it. I'm dealing with students who never learned it. It
Correct.
was never even presented. They're like, oh, that's a thing.
Correct.
So meanwhile, there's a teacher somewhere getting paid a full salary with benefits. And I'm sitting home trying to find individual students, right? So this shouldn't be happening. Parents are paying twice. Most of my students are from Asian families. The parents are very dissatisfied because they sent their kids, a lot of them are immigrant parents. The kids were born here. They sent their kids to American schools and they're like, my kid doesn't know how to do anything. What the heck?
Yep.
So this just shouldn't be happening. And I did want to be, so there's not a clean segue into this, but you just mentioned about how he can have conversations and, so he's able to, learn and do all the things. He's just not being taught. But there are kids that you've dealt with, and you brought it up in the beginning, who come into the class who's having suffered trauma and having certain impediments to, as the jargon goes, access the learning or access the education because of what we would call social and emotional constraints, right? And I did want to talk before we finished up about social emotional learning, because I talk a lot on the channel about how parents need to beware of SEL and SEL in their schools. And I've specifically introduced them to the concept of transformative SEL. But I think you had some things to say about what SEL was meant to be and who needs it. And, so again, there's like truth, there's little grains of truth and things that you've heard about. It's just been like morphed and changed and balkanized into something that it wasn't intended to be. So now your students actually need SEL and it may have already been rewritten to be all this social justice stuff. So tell us about what SEL is actually intended for and how you envision it working properly.
So SEL, and I have to be honest, I mean, I've only spent maybe 3 or 4 years in the SEL world, so there may be history about it that I'm unfamiliar with, but in my opinion, SEL is designed to give children who may not have had coping skills, self-regulation skills, who may have not been taught just general relationship skills, communication skills. Maybe their parents unfortunately were neglectful and didn't teach those skills. And so they arrive in school, they don't know how to self-regulate when they get angry or upset, and maybe they turn a bookcase over because they're so upset and they can't, have that self-control, that self-regulation. They a lot of times have only seen that kind of behavior modeled, and they just think that's the appropriate response to I'm upset and angry or sad, because that's what has been modeled. So, it's good to learn self-control. It's good to learn self-regulation. It's good to learn how to interact with your peers, how to, do those. Those are great and wonderful things and things that you need in the world. So I have a lot of students who didn't learn that in the home and aren't learning that in the home. So it's good to have those lessons in at school because they're not getting them anywhere else. However, you and I talked about this a little before. There are many children who don't need that, whose parents are doing a stellar job. They learned all those skills. They don't need to sit through those lessons. So so this is a time where there does need to be some individualization, pulling children, having small groups. And I will say about the school that I'm in currently, they are doing a good job with that. So I do have small groups that I meet with. I do like a really generalized lesson with K through 5th grades. I do a really generalized lesson just about emotions, self-regulation. It's very base level. And it's almost like a refresher, like, hey, I came in here a couple weeks ago. We talked about this. Who remembers that? We just have this brief lesson. And then I have small groups that I meet with of children from those classrooms that really do need extra supports.
Right.
And then I meet individually with students who need extra supports. So I do think my school is doing a good job in how they're managing that. But I do know other schools who are just taking this blanket approach that every child has trauma, that every child needs this. And you and I talked a little bit about that before.
Right. And listening to you talk about what classifies as trauma ought to be eye-opening for people in the audience. We hear the word bandied about to the point where it has almost no meaning. We're seeing signs up, and I think it's at Colorado State or one of the universities out there where they have it. If you've been affected by someone's free speech presentation, here are the 23 places you can go. And I'm like, to what? Get slapped and told to unenroll from college?
Right.
So, they were treating people who really need to buck up a little bit, right? As if there's trauma. And then you've got kids who saw their parents murdered, right? That's trauma. And that's somebody who definitely needs some SEL care, but they also, and I think you would probably agree, need it from someone like a social worker or a licensed clinician. They need this kind of teaching and care from someone who, first of all, has been properly trained in how to interact with children when you're talking about subjects that are sensitive, and also has certain accountability metrics in place and certain kinds of boundaries and guardrails around what they're doing. And I think with SEL, what they've been doing is just empowering teachers, random elementary school teacher, like what I was, to say, do psychological work, do group therapy effectively with these kids. And that is just not okay. That shouldn't be done.
Right. Some like right now, I'm starting a new small group. I had a small group last semester, 9 weeks, whatever. And I have a new small group this time. And these children, for instance, they display behaviors that are, like lack of self-regulation. Maybe they have issues like maybe they steal, maybe they lie, they have difficult peer relations. They don't have very good peer relationships.
Right.
And so like I'm meeting with them weekly and we're doing like character development. So like we're doing like, what does it mean to be responsible? What does it mean to be respectful? What does it mean to be dependable? What does it mean to be, grateful? I'm trying to think of all the ones that we're going to go over.
But these are still individual traits
Yes.
And these are still presented to individual students or small groups of students who've been identified
Correct.
as having the need. And what my complaint and others have been complaining about with SEL is, like you said, now I actually wouldn't have a big problem with the character development stuff being blanket applied, because I
I
think
wish
all of
that
our
was
students.
more blanket applied, but I'm doing this like on my own.
No,
Yeah.
I understand. But, instead it's more like, which parent do you get along with better
Right.
and why? And like it just really intrusive, boundary violating kinds of questions. And it's done with an eye towards having the children, it's very intentional,
Mhm.
at having the children be outer directed,
Mhm.
motivated towards group identity, motivated towards group obligation,
Mhm.
which is absolutely different than what you're doing. And
Mhm.
I wanted Gigi to point this out to everybody today, because like so many things that we're seeing talked about in education today, they once upon a time was an idea that was good and still exists,
Mhm.
right? It's still
Mhm.
SEL
Mhm.
has a purpose that she just explained. And I think most of us would agree that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, we need that. There are kids who
Mhm.
need that. But does it then follow that all the students need it? And should it be used as kind of a Trojan horse
Mhm.
to change the child's worldview?
Correct. Correct. Right.
Right.
And there are times I'm given a lot of liberty in how I teach these
Right.
lessons. So I really have a lot of freedom, thankfully, to not have this Trojan horse SEL um, approach lesson going on in the classroom. I really am trying to like get down to the bones of it and talk about, you know, you're angry.
Yeah.
And are you angry about something because it's just that's not the way you like it? You're just, I prefer it's a preference, or are you angry about something that really is something that is worthy of being angry about, kind of thing, like breaking down like what's good anger, what's just kind of selfish anger, that kind of thing. So I've been given a lot of
So you're
liberty.
not just automatically validating negative emotions?
I do
Gigi.
say, yeah, I do say that, there's that feeling something like, when you feel anger or when you feel jealousy or when you feel, grumpy or whatever, that those feelings arise in all of us.
Right, of course, yes.
Those it's not like there's not anything like necessarily wrong that those feelings bubble up inside of you. I mean, sometimes they just do and you can't help it,
Sure, sure.
whatever. Who knows? Maybe your
But
cat died
you're
the night
asking
before.
them to question the source of the like, do your feelings like, are they an accurate reflection of reality?
Yes, yes.
And that is such an important life skill.
Mhm, mhm.
My friend Barbara says you've got to have the right, you've got to have the right information to know if what you know is true. Like,
Correct,
and then you have to know what's true in order to have the right feeling about it.
correct.
So
Yes.
if feelings do bubble up, as you say, sometimes they just do. We're
Mhm.
human beings. But then having an adult, be rational and sit with the child and say, all right, let's look at it. Um, is that true that, everything is terrible, or, whatever they might be saying? And
Right,
can we
right,
find something that isn't,
right.
so that you can, I mean, how better can you manage anger and
Mhm,
is than to
mhm,
put it in perspective?
mhm, mhm.
And let's say it does accurately reflect their reality.
Right.
Then, okay, anger's not constructive anger is supposed to point us towards a solution. So
Mhm.
now what are we going to do about that,
Right,
right?
right.
So this is such an important life skill.
Mhm.
And instead, what I'm seeing is SEL towards, oh, you're angry. Yes, yes, feel. That's valid. And who made you angry? Let's punish them.
Right, right. Yeah, and no, I take special care to not go that approach. I mean, it really is like taking their emotions and like looking at them in light of reality.
Right.
And what is really now I have a student whose father was shot and killed in front of him. And he was it was actually a police officer. And he finally got to the point where he said, because he's had all this anger, he's had all this sadness, and he said, "I wanna talk to the police officer that did it." Like, in his mind, like, that was a solution. Like, if I could just talk to him and ask him some questions, I think I could be at peace with what happened. And maybe we think, "Well, that's not a very good idea, he should," but if you're thinking about the way that he felt, the grief, the anger, everything he felt, those are,
Right.
I would say those are valid. Those are maybe not valid, but reasonable. Anybody would feel probably those things, a range of
Mhm.
those things, if they saw that at a young age. Certainly at a young age, because you're not able to think about the world
Right.
in a mature way. You just have a very, your scope is very limited. So your
Mhm.
emotions, they come up and you don't really know how to sort through them properly. So in his mind, talking to that police officer was a rational solution to dealing with his anger and his grief. And
Right.
so how do you, talk through that? Okay, you've come up with a solution, something you think would be beneficial to you. And then
Mhm.
talking through the consequences of that, positive and negative. And
Mhm.
then of course the police officer would have to agree to that kind of thing. So with SEL, I think there is a place for it with certain students, and I think it does need to be more individualized, or at least in small group settings. But I don't think that this blanket SEL approach that we're taking now
Mhm.
is necessary, needed, and I do think you're right that it is a Trojan horse for other ideologies that
Right.
we're seeping into.
And that's the
Gotcha.
problem.
Mhm, mhm.
So, to wrap up this wonderful conversation, and I can't thank you enough for coming in and
That
educating
was
us
my
about all of
pleasure.
this. But, what can the general public do to support your efforts specifically, and also just this kind of a thing? Who needs to hear from us? What do we need to do to kind of raise the awareness about this sort of intermediate process, or like alternative school for refugees or whatever? Like, who I feel like people don't know about this enough, and what can we do?
Well, I think that, first of all, I mean, everybody doesn't live in my city, so they can't,
Right.
they don't, it doesn't necessarily apply to them. But I would say if you are involved in education, if you are part of a diverse city, kind of look to see maybe what your refugee population is and how many are in the schools. And then at your own local level, advocate for those students. Like, are they being served? What are their needs? I mean, this all goes back to a school choice issue.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
all of my students are districted for the worst performing district in the county.
And they're trapped. They're
They're
effectively
trapped.
trapped.
They are
So
literally trapped
so
in that
next time
district.
anybody hears that school choice is just for racist rich people, remember this show.
Remember the refugees who are, and I use the term redlined. They are zoned and trapped often in the most, because what happens is they typically are housed in the cities, in the urban places, because they have access to transportation, and that's typically where the resettlement agency office is located, so it's walkable. So then all their children are then in the urban setting, and a lot of times those urban schools are Title I underperforming schools. It's just the way it is. So these children are zoned for these underperforming schools. There's no way for them to get out of them. And refugee parents, they're just trying to survive. So they're not thinking about, oh, I might have an option, or oh, I should advocate for an option. So that's when people like us, and I'm not putting me or you on a pedestal, but it's when people who are in the system, who kind of see how things are working, it's just really important for us to raise awareness and say, hey,
True.
this is what's actually going on. These
Right.
children are being put in these positions where they have no choice whatsoever, and they're failing, they're neglected. Um,
Mhm.
so I think just bringing awareness to this population, saying they really are the underserved in the
Yeah.
public.
Right.
And then, like
Yeah.
in my particular city, for me, I mean, I hate to say that it does come down to funding, but it does come down to funding and support, because I don't want to be tied with federal money in this endeavor, because I want to be able to do what I want to do. So finding private donors, finding people who are willing to come in and say, "Hey, I want to partner with you and do this," is really essential. I have a couple of people that are grant writing friends of mine that we've talked about, sources. I've considered, do I want to go and try to partner an umbrella with a private school? There's just lots of different avenues.
Mhm.
But I have support. I have community schools directors in the public school. I have private school support. I have a church support. So it's coming together slowly but surely. But it is quite an endeavor to get off the ground.
Well, still, I I applaud you that you're even trying it, because there are so many people well positioned to just do this,
Mhm.
and they're not doing it.
Mhm. Right,
They're not
right,
even talking about doing it.
right.
So, like I said, the incentives seem a bit perverse at the moment, but it's just how it is.
It is.
But
We're just chipping away, just a little bit at a time. Just chip, 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 inch by
that's
inch. Life's a cinch. We just gotta take it, a little
that's
bit at
all
a
we
time.
can do. We just got
Yes,
to we got to build that lifeboat, right? I keep
yes,
talking about it.
yes, yes.
Well, Gigi, thank you so
Thank
much for coming
you.
in and sharing all this information with us. Everybody who's been watching, thank you for watching. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and your comments. Please do consider sharing the broadcast out with anyone else you think might be interested in it. The replay will be available immediately. And you can follow Going Godward on Twitter, right? At Going Godward, exactly like that.
Yes,
And you
ma'am.
can keep up with her work that way. So thank you again, everybody. Have a great afternoon. I'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Deb. See you.